There we go. Welcome to the Small Business Resource Network's webinar series. The Small Business Resource Network, or SBRN, is a network of professionals who provide services to the small business community, and we're an affiliate of the Florida Small Business Development Center at UNF. So I want to welcome everybody today. My name is Nancy Boyle. I'm the director of SBRN. And just to give you a little bit of a commercial, our members are accountants, business attorneys, commercial lenders, commercial insurance agents, business consultants, a variety of government and nonprofit organizations, and some select corporations. All of these folks have been vetted for their level of experience. So if you are interested or need professional service providers or just looking for resources or information, you can visit our website at www.sbrn.org. Before we begin our webinar today, just a couple of things. If you have questions, please type them in the question box on your control panel, and we'll address questions at the end. We are recording this, so once we finished, the recording will be posted on our YouTube channel, and as you may have heard earlier, we'll put it out on LinkedIn, etc. You will receive an evaluation. It's a short evaluation after today's event. We really appreciate it if you would complete that for us. So without further ado, let's get into the reason people are attending today. Our webinar is called Level the Playing Field, and our speakers are Lori Cimino and Betsy Santiago with Florida State College at Jacksonville. So let me start with Betsy. Betsy loves to match people with opportunities and with other people. She's the business solutions strategist at FSCJ, and she's able to identify and deliver customized training that helps companies grow, expand, and retain employees through staff development courses, licensing, and certifications. And I'm going to turn this over to Betsy and let her introduce Lori, and off we go. So thank you, Betsy and Lori. And I'm going to close me out.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you to the SBRN for this opportunity. I know that Lori and I are very excited to be here today and be able to challenge you with this new opportunity to level the playing field with the deaf community. So I understand that this is a little bit different topic, uncommon for business setting, of course, but it is something that is very relevant, especially right now with the COVID-19 pandemic, and how does this really affect our hearing and non-hearing community? It's everything from sales to return on investment. Why do you want to get involved with this ecosystem that we're going to talk about today? So my guest today is Lori Cimino. She moved to Jacksonville from Miami in 1995. She is hearing and was born to an all-hearing family. So kind of a little bit different approach here. After meeting two deaf children in her neighborhood as a child, she became interested in sign language and deaf people. And then in high school, her interest turned to passion when she enrolled in an American Sign Language class her sophomore year. She received a bachelor's degree from Florida International University in special education and a master's from the University of North Florida in deaf education. However, her experience in the deaf community has been her best education for ASL and deaf culture. She has 24 years of experience as an educator, including her position as a behavior specialist at Florida School for the Deaf and Blind, and she began her career at Florida State College of Jacksonville 15 years ago. She is an adjunct professor back then, and she has been an ASL English interpreting program manager for the last 19 of those 15 years. She is also a nationally certified interpreter and has been working in the field of interpretation for 13 years. So this is somebody who really understands this community, understands what we're about to talk about, and really we wanted to focus again on how COVID has really affected this community and what's happening. So Lori, let's start with the why. Why is this an important topic for business owners to even be considering right now of how to level this playing field for the deaf community? maybe you can share some statistics with us about our local area and why this is important.
Absolutely. And you'll have to forgive my passion because I get really passionate, excited about this topic. So hopefully you can sense some of that. So as you'll see here on the slide that I've shared, there's a huge why, a very, very big why. So it's estimated here in the United States, there's 37.5 million individuals with hearing loss. And then if you narrow that down, there's 11.5 million people who identify as deaf and hard of hearing. So hearing loss is going to be any kind of range from a very slight hearing loss to profoundly deaf. But individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing fall into a very specific range and identify that way. Lots of people don't identify as deaf, hard of hearing. And then if we go even more narrowed and we look just at Florida, there's 800,000 individuals who identify as deaf and hard of hearing in our state. And we don't often really think about that unless you're involved in this field in some way. And there's large pockets in Miami, Orlando, Tampa, and the Jacksonville areas. You would expect these are large metropolitan areas. And here in Jacksonville and Northeast Florida, we have a huge population. And one of the reasons for that is that we are located only 30 miles north of the Florida School for the Deaf and the Blind. And so it's not uncommon all across the nation for there to be large populations of deaf people near schools for the deaf. And one of the reasons is because they can get employment in that area, in those settings, and they have access to communication in those areas typically. So as you'll see, that's a gigantic why. I think it's a pretty big number. And then, you know, if we, it's a big number. And then if we look at just educational institutions, and if you think of educational institutions as responsive to our community, whether we're colleges or universities, here in Northeast Florida, we have 4 colleges and universities that have deaf-related disciplines. So we have deaf education, interpreting, and speech language pathology, all up here in the Northeast Florida area. Tampa also has 3 programs focused in interpreting and deaf studies. And then down in South Florida, they have interpreting. So there is a need to meet the needs of this entire population across the state. So it's a big why, I think.
That is a big why. That's a very big why. I didn't realize that there was such a large community and such a large need in this area. So, wow, those are big numbers. So you've talked about different types of hearing loss or deaf. Do they all communicate the same way?
No, definitely not. So as I mentioned, that's 37.5 million. That's a huge range. And then we narrow it down more to individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing. And so really, I'd like to share with you the concept of deaf versus deaf from a lowercase d to an uppercase D, because this really centers around communication and how individuals identify. So as you'll see up here, the lowercase d, it's just focused on the audiological condition of deafness. So if we refer to deaf, it is just that person has some type of hearing loss. But if we refer to individuals as capital D or big D, deaf, which is how we talk about it in our field, that really means that someone has identified and is a part of our deaf culture and the deaf community. And so that means that they are engaging and interacting with deaf people, and they are using American Sign Language. So there is a lot of difference. On the lowercase d, or those individuals who may not identify as deaf, they're probably using more gestures, more writing back and forth, speech reading. And just a fun fact for you is that 30% of lip reading is accurate on the lips. So that leaves 70% of miscommunication possible. So there's a misconception that lip reading is really effective, and some people are brilliant at it, but really the studies show 30% accuracy. So there's a big communication difference between these individuals. And you know, if we think about just communication, I think for many people who haven't engaged or interacted with deaf people, that's their biggest inhibition. I'll use the word even fear or discomfort, is how do I engage? How do I communicate with someone who's deaf? And you may not even notice people are deaf, but you will after today, I promise you. You'll identify individuals in your community who are deaf. So yeah, there's a wide range of communication strategies, but really when we're talking about that culturally deaf, we're talking about American Sign Language or sign language, because some people don't really learn American Sign Language until they become older and really locked into the deaf community.
Wow. So Yeah, that's huge. I know that right now, you know, with this whole COVID pandemic that we're experiencing, there's been a lot of unemployment. I can imagine that for somebody who is deaf or hard of hearing, that those numbers are perhaps increased that much more. Can you tell us a little bit? I know we've talked a little bit about this deaf ecosystem and what's happening, how they're kind of trying to solve their own problem, and also how they're opening up opportunities for other business owners to also get engaged with that. Can you tell us a little bit more about this ecosystem and how that's coming about?
Absolutely. And I think to understand the deaf ecosystem, it's really important to understand that deaf culture is a collectivist culture. And so collectivist cultures function with the group more in mind than they do the individual. And so because there's been such chronic unemployment in the deaf community or underemployment, and it's of course escalated, especially in the COVID crisis, but because of that, the deaf community and their collectivist nature have gathered together and have worked to create an ecosystem that focuses on tapping into deaf businesses, deaf professionals, deaf organizations, schools for the deaf, or other institutions that serve individuals who are deaf, and really sharing resources and making sure that everybody can thrive and become more self-reliant. And you will, if you go around the country, you will find deaf-owned pizza parlors, you will find coffee shops that are deaf-owned, breweries. There's even companies now where they're doing like handyman, manual labor work, real estate agents, photography. So there's a lot of deaf professionals or deaf-owned companies that are really working collectively to try to lift each other up and make those connections. And of course, that does require partnership with the hearing business community, because you know it is small. When you, as big as that number is, it is a very small community. But that's what the deaf ecosystem is, and that concept in terms just coined in the last couple of years. And a lot of that has also been because of the catalyst of technology. So many years ago, access and communication was a big struggle, but now with the communication technology that we have these days, deaf people can really navigate our hearing space, our hearing businesses, our hearing world better than they ever have. And actually, another fun fact for you, in Washington, D.C., which is very near Gallaudet University, it's the only liberal arts university for the deaf, there is a Starbucks, and that Starbucks is a completely signing Starbucks. So you cannot work or be employed at that particular Starbucks unless you know sign language. So they employ many deaf people, but they also employ hearing people, but you have to know sign language. And they opened one in Malaysia as well. But there's companies like that, Amazon, UPS, that are really focusing on tapping into the skills of our deaf community because they have a lot of skills. It's just that, how do I communicate? What am I going to have to do if I hire someone deaf? That kind of holds people back. But there's big corporations that get it, and they're connecting into this deaf ecosystem.
That's really, really interesting. And so it sounds like this is a community that's very collective. If you are able to reach one, then you get pretty much the rest of them as well. The ecosystem would be something that as a business owner, I would love to participate in and be a part of that as well. And it seems like there's really low barriers to entry to this. I mean, you basically just need to be able to be friendly, and that opens the opportunities for you. So share with me a little bit more on the difference between accessibility. How do I make my company more accessible to this deaf community, and how do we better serve them? What would be an appropriate use? How would I enter into this ecosystem and into this community?
That's a great question. And of course, is where I spend my life, right? As a certified sign language interpreter, accessibility is what I do. But I'll click over here to this next slide. Often when we think of accessibility, we think of physical barriers. So individuals who are blind or sight impaired or visually impaired, or individuals who are disabled, maybe in a wheelchair. We also often think of accessibility being physical things that we need to do. We need to build a ramp. We need to provide this space. But really, for individuals who are deaf, it's all centered around communication. So a lot of these icons in the slide is talking about open caption, closed caption, interpreting, TTYs, or devices that used to be able to talk on. We have other communication methods now for telephone use for individuals who are deaf, which has just exploded their employment opportunities. But when we think of accessibility for individuals who are deaf, it's really communication, effective communication. How can we communicate with individuals who are deaf? And then how can we focus on understanding that they access the world visually? Okay, so flashing lights and things like that that make all these safety features that we have that are dependent on hearing. You know, if the lightning goes off at a football field, it's a big loud sound. So how do you make that accessible? So if we think about communication and visual access to information and sounds, that's really what accessibility is. And that is a little different than being deaf friendly. Deaf friendly would of course include being accessible, but deaf friendly is a little bit more of that, you know, becoming aware, identifying how can I make things, how maybe it's not required by the ADA for me to be accessible in this way, but how do I ensure that when a deaf person walks into my business that I'm ready and people are ready, and can we write with them? Are we trained? Are people aware of deaf people? Do I have something I can hand them in print so that they could get some kind of communication? Am I willing to write with them or text with them? Different things like that. So being deaf friendly really, and sight lines, visual sight lines. A lot of times in the hearing world, we have everything blocks everything because we can use our ears, but with deaf people, eye contact's everything. So being able to see each other and see the information and see what's happening with their eyes. If you think about that, their eyes are everything. That's the way that they take in the world. And if you look from that lens, then you'll find your deaf friendly way. So that's really and the gist, the difference between those two and kind of what they are.
Wow. Wow. And I didn't even think about that, right? I mean, we just take it for granted. I think you used the term the other day with me, privileged, that we're privileged to have these thoughts and ideas. And we don't even think about the fact that, you know, if I can't read your lips or I can't hear you, how am I interpreting your message and what you're sharing with the world? So I kind of go back to, from the business perspective, why would I even want to get involved with this community? I mean, it seems like there's a lot of tools, but why would I want to make myself accessible as a company?
Yes, awesome. Aside from just having a super strong moral compass, of course, we are business, right? So what is your return on investment, and what's the value in engaging in the deaf community? So obviously in the why segment we talked about, there's numbers, right? There's deaf people everywhere. But when you also go back to that concept of collectivism and the deaf culture and the deaf community, the deaf grapevine and the deaf word of mouth and the deaf community is very strong and very powerful. So let's just say you're a waitress at a restaurant and you start signing with those two patrons. Those two patrons are going to come find you. Those two patrons are going to tell their friends to come find you, and they're going to tell their friends to come find you. And they're going to go to spaces that are deaf friendly, that provide access, that make them feel comfortable, just like we all do, right? So I'm not going to go get my hair cut by somebody that I don't enjoy, or I'm not going to go purchase a car to where I've been treated poorly. So, having that, being open to that, and that word of mouth, and then that information sharing that happens along in the deaf community is very, very powerful. And yeah, so I guess that word of mouth is really great, and it's great marketing. And if you look at, there's Amazon commercials and Pepsi commercials. And so again, the big corporations understand there is a deaf market. If they didn't, they wouldn't be creating commercials that had access. Disney World, if you really have watched a lot of these commercials, a lot of these huge corporations are targeting the deaf community for some of their marketing. And that inclusiveness, we all want to feel included, right?
That's fantastic. That's really important. So if we had to walk away from today's conversation, are there some tips that you could share with our business community of how they can get involved and they can help as well?
Yes, absolutely. So this is a good little visual to share with you. There are, of course, many others, and this is tips for the workplace, but these tips, focus whether or not you hire a deaf employee or whether or not you have deaf participants or deaf consumers in your business. These things would all be similar. Um, you want to make sure before you're engaging with a deaf person that they have your attention, that they can turn around and they can look at your face. There's a lot of non-manual communication that happens on the face. And even though not all deaf people are lip readers, there's a lot that comes around the mouth that provides us information. And so if you think mask wearing and the impact that's having on our deaf community, if you're curious, Google it. But imagine your whole world just got covered up. And so even if I do this right now, you're probably not 100% comfortable, but you're hearing privileged, right? So you can work around it. But for someone who's deaf, that covering of the face is really, really impactful. So considering that in the COVID environment right now, considering that there are people, even if they're not big D deaf and signers, there's a lot of people with hearing loss, 37.5 million. So we have 37.5 million people across the country maybe missing something, right? And being less engaged. Also, it's important light, like we talked about visual space. So light, you don't want to communicate in dark spaces, or you need to have light. You need to make sure things are well lit. And let's say you have a deaf employee, or you're going to have some kind of seminar where you're trying to sell a product. Think about how taxing it can be for someone who's deaf to watch something and constantly struggle to see it. So, if we had a mumble, like if you think about, Charlie Brown, that wah, 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 which is a lot of people are talking about that right now, right? Oh, I finally understand what that means. That lack of clarity makes you have to like really hone in and focus, and it's exhausting. It's cognitively draining. It's physically draining. So imagine deaf people navigating their environment not well lit, not being able to see things clearly, constantly having to try to move around something to see what's happening. Face to face is important. And actually, it's pretty cool. With sign language, we always communicate 4 to 6 feet apart because you're using your hands and you're moving. So there's no close talking with deaf people. That doesn't happen. So if you watch deaf people engage, they're always 4 to 6 feet apart. So they actually, have really enjoyed the fact of all this distance. They're like, oh, that's normal for us, but you do want to be face to face. Speak your normal pace. Speak clearly. Don't go extra slow. Don't go extra fast. Don't enunciate on your lips. Definitely don't scream. But often we think if we turn it up a little bit, then it's more accessible. And there may be people who are hard of hearing that increase in sound happens. But for the most part, you want to talk at your normal pace. Don't do anything exaggerated. If you're using an interpreter, make sure that you're engaging with the person who's deaf. So the interpreter is there to relay communication, but they are not who you are talking to. So anytime that you have to pull in an interpreter for whatever reason, you want to make sure that you're still engaging with the deaf person and eye contact with the deaf person. And don't refer to them and say, can you tell her? Can you tell him? But the person is physically present right in front of you and engaged. So, being mindful of like, okay, I'm talking here, the interpreter can hear me. I don't need to look at the interpreter. And I know sometimes that's uncomfortable the first couple times that people may tap into an interpreter, but it's really important. And then I love the circular icon here on the left, on the bottom. Don't keep repeating things. Say it differently. And we do this sometimes, right? We just say it or say it louder or say it stronger, but if that didn't work, try something another way, add gesture to it, write it differently, or just change some words around, or but don't keep saying the same thing. If someone's not understanding you, whether they're deaf or they're hearing, if someone's not understanding you, try something different with them, because that shows a general interest, and you want to connect with them, and you care, and you want to communicate. And then this is an important one on the bottom left too. If you do have deaf individuals in your space, don't make the assumption that they don't want to be that they don't want to be involved in things, and make sure that they're included in things. So if there's a dialogue that's happening, don't assume that just because they're deaf over there that they're fine with being deaf over there. Many deaf people want to engage with other people, and yeah, you may have to do things differently, but deaf people can be very isolated, and in this COVID environment we're all a little bit isolated, and our deaf community, really, that isolation has ticked up a great bit. Also, COVID impacts, which I think are really important to talk about. We're living virtually. All of us are on a screen. So, right about now, your eyes are in a certain space, your mind's drifting, maybe you're checking email. We're distracted by so many things. But for people who are deaf, they have to pay attention. Like in order to get information, they don't have this auditory input coming. So they have to pay attention to what is happening. And if you imagine all the tech issues or how many people can be on a Zoom call or things like that, our deaf community is really being challenged to attend and focus to visual stimuli. And if there is no interpreter and they're using caption, that can get very draining and exhausting too. And captions not always accurate. So that, but just, overall access to information sharing is a value, big time value in the deaf community. And it is because they always have to seek out information, right? They don't have it readily available in their ears like we do when we're hearing. So yeah, those are some tips. And just ask a person, how can I communicate better with you? How can I not like, how can I help you? Not always help, right? But like, how can I communicate more effectively with you? What would make you feel more comfortable in my space? And they'll let you know, because the deaf community is very open and very direct in their conversation as a communication style.
That's really interesting. And that, all of these tips, they're just so helpful. But it makes so much sense. As somebody who speaks a second language, I can tell you that, yes, this is exactly what happens. We speak louder and we say it 1,000 times and it's still not communicating. If you don't understand what they said, then all of this makes so much sense. This is a lot of information and just some really great tips. Thank you for sharing those. Lori, as we're coming to a close here, I'd love an opportunity for you to kind of share a little bit from your heart. What challenges would you have for the business community? Is there any information about the work that you're doing, any way that companies can really engage and really take advantage of this opportunity to really connect with a new segment of the market?
I think, being here, being present, and becoming more aware, right? So becoming more aware of deaf people in the deaf community, and how to connect with them is very important. And just kind of keep deaf people in your thought process as you're going through things. Also, gaining a little knowledge and identifying ways that you can be more accessible or more deaf friendly. And it doesn't have to be an expensive investment. Sometimes there's really simple things. Also, I encourage you to, tap into that deaf ecosystem. If you have the ability where you need to hire a contractor, or you're trying to have a partnership with some other organization or company, seek out a deaf-owned business or connect with individuals in the community who are deaf. Tap in to see what their skill sets are. Take a chance, hire a deaf employee, and also realize that not one deaf person does not equal all deaf people any more than hearing people do. Partner with some local organizations. The Center for Independent Living locally has a really good program for deaf individuals, and work on partnering them for jobs and all sorts of things. So, you can get engaged in that way too. But I think knowledge, awareness, openness, and just, being willing to, step out of your comfort zone and consider how you can engage with deaf people in your market. And just another fun fact, like IKEA, when IKEA came to town and IKEA had their big grand opening, IKEA had an interpreter there. So from the get-go, IKEA said we are accessible to our deaf community. And so, everybody loves IKEA. So do individuals who are deaf. So just little things that you can do, and identify what ways you can make things accessible through interpreting or technology and those type of things.
That's fantastic. That really is. You touched on so many different things, awareness and opportunities, and I just think this is a really important topic, that not one that we often consider as you know, it's a privilege for us to be able to hear, and so perhaps we have been a little bit unsympathetic to this community, but it sounds like there's a lot of opportunity. The investment, I imagine, is different depending on the technology that you want to use. But you gave us some really simple tips and some simple ideas of how we can at least be more friendly towards this community and be more intentional about how to connect with this very large and massive ecosystem. I love that how you shared how they connect with one another. So really it's about getting your first person in the door and then multiplying that target market for your own business. But thank you so much for this opportunity, to the SBRN, to Nancy and the entire group. Thank you to Lori Semino for this wonderful conversation to really just get us thinking about something that perhaps we haven't thought about before. So Nancy, we will turn it over to you at this point. If there's any questions, anything that we can answer before we sign off today.
Well, while we're waiting to see if any of our attendees have questions, I do have a question for you, Lori.
Sure.
Because you had mentioned briefly the technology, and so I'm thinking from a hearing business owner's perspective, if they do want to broaden their horizons and communicate or attract customers who are deaf, what kind of technology would you need? I mean, are smartphones a way? I mean, you know, everybody, I have not mastered thumbs, but you know, so I used one finger, but you know, so many people are pretty good with their thumbs and text messages. So could you kind of elaborate on that a little bit, you know, as to, you know, what could that business owner do to make it easier to communicate or even to get in the door the customer who is deaf?
Okay, that's a great question. So, you know, there's two different perspectives. There's individuals who you may have deaf that may be employed, and then there's you just drawing in that deaf market in some way. And I'll tell you, probably one of the easiest, completely free ways to connect better with deaf individuals is to understand the function of telecommunication relay and video relay. So video relay is how individuals who are deaf use the telephone. It's federally funded by the FCC. And so individuals who are deaf that want to call and, you know, buy a plane ticket or ask about a part or purchase a house or whatever that are using the phone can go through the video relay service. And on the other side of that is a hearing person. And the better that hearing person understands what they're doing, who they're talking to, and all of that kind of stuff, and kind of engaging and being comfortable with it. That in and of itself, when, you know, if somebody just calls your business to inquire and you respond and you're, oh yeah, oh, you're using video relay service, and you can just engage in a conversation and be patient and go back and forth, that alone, and you don't have to install anything. You just have to understand that when you hear someone come over the line that says, you know, this is an interpreted phone call for somebody who's using sign language, that you're like, oh, okay, I know what this is. And train your employees so that they know, so that people don't get hung up on, so that people are more patient. And, you know, again, talk at your normal pace. Don't go slow-mo, don't go fast. If you spit out a phone number, do it at a pace that someone could get it. And, you know, consider the deaf person on the other side might need to write things down, and, you know, so they can't, like, we can listen and write, but deaf people, when they're taking down information, have to look up and down, and it's a little different. So, I mean, just understanding that, what is video relay, what is, and telecommunication relay with telephones, none of us really have landlines anymore, but it does still exist. So that's one way. If you have employees who are deaf, then looking into video remote interpreting. So you can hire live interpreters, and you can also have video remote interpreting, which is just having the ability to click onto the computer and an interpreter pops up, and you and a person who are deaf can have a conversation through an interpreter. So it's great for if you have someone that's employed, but it's also great if you want to have dialogue about something, and and someone who's deaf. How do I get that? How do I get a video remote interpreting if I don't want to pull a live interpreter in there? And then I think, like I mentioned, I mean, really interpreters, I mean, there's technology, but then there's also interpreters. And consider reaching out to local institutions that train interpreters, because those institutions are often looking for opportunities for their students to work and practice. So there's certain opportunities in interpreting that need to be a certain qualification covered by the ADA, but then there's other things that aren't. And those are great opportunities for you to show that you're engaging with the deaf community and then also partnering with interpreting training programs and just letting the deaf individuals know, hey, we're welcoming you, we're trying to communicate and meet your needs, and then let them tell you what they need. Let them tell you what they need. Then there's CART, which is real-time captioning, and that's going to be something that's more large audience based. So, if you have a business where you're doing large presentations and things like that, then sometimes CART can be a good thing to have so that information is accessible. And you would be surprised how many hearing people tap into the caption when it's available too. People sit in the back and they miss somebody and then they watch, so those are just a couple of them. Again, interpreters, and then video remote interpreting, video relay interpreting, and understanding what that is, and then CART services. But other stuff like flashing lights and all that stuff, that should be part of the ADA compliance that businesses and buildings have when they build now.
Okay, well, speaking of ADA compliance,
Mm-hmm.
any business that does not have a website is really not a very effective business. So let's talk a little bit about what that business owner would need to do to make their website A, ADA compliant, and B, attractive to the deaf community.
So, let's say you have a social media page and you're posting content on social media and it's all sound based. Obviously there's visual stuff there because it's a video,
Sure.
but, ensuring that what is happening is accessible via caption, maybe providing a written transcript in the comments, especially, we haven't talked about a population of deaf-blind people, but individuals who are deaf-blind often depend on that written transcript. Because accessing the visual and the auditory can be a challenge. But yeah, if you put up a video, then you just put a little transcript down in the comments that makes the sound that's not accessible there accessible here. That's another way. Again, if you're partnering with local organizations, they can say, hey, could you guys interpret this video, and you can throw it up that way through social media. And just, when you're approaching whatever you're doing through your website or your social media, you're thinking how much of this is auditory dependent? And, if there's just sound, how do I make it visually accessible? So there are very particular ADA guidelines for a lot of things, but social media is less like that. That's why I mentioned social media more, because the websites have more specific guidelines, contrast sometimes. Again, if you're really text heavy on something, that cannot be the most accessible for a lot of people. But considering how you're writing the communication, keeping in mind that for many deaf people, English is not their first language. It is their second language. So again, if you make something like that, if you tweak that, it benefits many people, right? It doesn't just benefit deaf people, it benefits many people. So I think that effective communication of visual access, if you could just kind of replay that in your head, then I think it'll help you get there.
Yeah, and if your website is not ADA compliant, it's time to phone up your web hosting company and make it that way. So it doesn't
Nancy,
look like, yeah, go ahead.
If I can jump in for just 2 seconds. Sure. And put in a plug for SBRN as well. So for the college, for FSCJ, we do provide different services, classes, training, and different opportunities. If you want to do it for your company, or if you want to just sign up for one of our regular courses, those are available. But I also wanted to put in a plug for Joe Lemire, who actually helps us with SBRN, is an SBRN member, and who's also working on web page development for ADA compliance and hearing impaired. So really just look at, is it Elkin Innovation? It's just ELIC. ELIC.
E-L-Y-K, ELIC.
That's it. But here again, this is just another place where the SBRN has really brought us together. I now have a resource within our own community that can tie these two things together. So if this is something that a company is really interested in really diving in and taking that next step, there are resources available that can help you do that.
Mm-hmm.
Lori, you want to go ahead and put up that last slide that has your contact
Yes.
information?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I want to thank everybody for attending. We really appreciate that. If you would like more information, we've put up the phone numbers and email addresses for both Lori and Betsy. And, you know, please feel free to contact them directly. They would be more than happy to answer your questions, refer you to appropriate resources, etc. So I really want to thank both of you, Betsy and Lori, for coming up with this idea. You know, I mean, it was something that I think a lot of us, you know, never really thought about, you know, in our day-to-day environment. If we don't have someone that we've encountered who is hearing impaired, that you know, is in the deaf community or the deaf ecosystem, as you mentioned, Lori, you know, it doesn't come to mind. So I think it's appropriate and timely that we're really addressing this. So I really appreciate it. So those of you that are attending today, you will be receiving a follow-up email. It will have a link to a short evaluation. If you would please take the time to do that. We need your feedback. That's how we get to do these things at no charge. So we really need your feedback. Hopefully you'll kind of watch your emails for announcements about upcoming events. We do have in 2 weeks an event coming up that's going to address PPP forgiveness. So for those business owners that got the PPP funding, you know, the crazy chaos around forgiveness, hopefully we'll be able to sort through that. So thank everybody for attending. We really appreciate it, and we'll catch you next time. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.